Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, it's my honor and privilege to be recognized to address you here on the floor of the United States House of Representatives, this great deliberative body that we have and are, and this deliberative body that brings this nation together to discuss our troubles, to discuss our triumphs, and sometimes intensively debate our disagreements here on the floor and in committee. We've seen a fair amount of that disagreement around the country. There are a few things that we see that brings this country together, and we join together in these efforts when we can be Americans and reach out with the hand of the American heart and spirit and help others when they're in sometimes dire need and dire difficulty. I come to the floor this afternoon, Mr. Speaker, to discuss one of these circumstances where Americans joined together and reached out their hands, not only of friendship, but of physically reached out their hands to deliver the kind of medical care that saved 3 lives from a terrible accident that took place in Tanzania. This terrible accident in Tanzania was worldwide news. There were 39 people on a bus in Tanzania, and all but 3 were students, children 12 to 13 years old. There were 2 teachers and a bus driver on the bus. And as the bus was, I will say, the reports that I get, the bus was going too fast. It went around the curve and reached the peak of a bump in the road, a rise in the road. The bus went airborne off the road into a ravine, and it crashed nose down in the same fashion that a plane might crash into the earth. And of the 39 people on the bus, 36 of them children, there were only 3 survivors. These 3 survivors were in the back of the bus, and all others in the front were thrown to the front, where the engine and the front part of the bus, all the way back to behind the driver, was jammed into the fuselage, I might call it, of the bus itself. And as that was jammed backwards, they were all thrown into that. The 3 survivors were in the back, and the violence to them was cushioned to a degree by those who had perished in front of them. Everyone else was essentially instantly killed, and these 3 children by the name of Wilson and Sadia and Doreen were survivors, and the bus was crushed together like a tin can. Behind the bus, 3 vehicles behind the bus, were some missionary workers that are associated with STEM, the Siouxland Tanzania Educational Medical Ministries, which is formed in Sioux City, Iowa, and it was formed by the inspiration of a long chain of I'll say, a hand of providence that arranged people together, and they were there in Tanzania, and following the bus, 3 vehicles behind, and the situation there was that as they saw the bus go off the road and crash, Mr. Speaker, the bus crashed down off into the ravine. They stopped. 3 of them were trained medical personnel named Kevin Nygaard and Jennifer Milby and Manda Volkert. I believe there are also a couple that I don't happen to have their names in front of me this evening, and I don't want to leave them out, Mr. Speaker. But they raced down the bank to the ravine where the bus had crashed nose down. They knew it was a terrible accident, and I don't think they could have imagined how bad and how terrible it was. But the only way to get in that bus was through the windows on the sides, the school bus type windows, as we know. Most all of us familiar with those, Mr. Speaker. And so they climbed into that bus and began to look for survivors and to try to pull the survivors out, and then the bodies of those who didn't survive. And they worked frantically there with other volunteers also who happened to come along to the scene. And they were able to remove the 3 survivors that I have mentioned, Wilson and Sadia and Doreen, and lay them out on the bank and help. They were all medically trained, and so they were applying first aid. These 3 kids, these 3 students, 12 to 13 years old, 2 girls and a boy, were then transported by ambulance into the city in Tanzania. Now, I didn't know that this had happened, even though it was international news. But I was on an international trip as well into the Balkans. I happened to be in Bosnia at the moment, in Sarajevo. I received a phone call from Dr. Steve Meyer. Steve Meyer is the founder of STEM, the Siouxland, Tanzania Educational Medical Mission. And his heart has gone out to Tanzania nearly 20 years ago. He spends about half of each year there doing missionary work and providing and conducting orthopedic surgery because he's an orthopedic surgeon. He's taught them how to farm, and he's drilling wells for irrigation. And he also is running an educational system there that, at least the last report I had, it was the largest non-public school in Tanzania, all done by the drive and the inspiration and the heart of Dr. Steve Meyer and his wife Dana. And so the people that work with him had contributed to the survival of the 3 students that they had to help pull out of that bus. But yet, I received a call from Steve Meyer. I was with the Sharzeh Affairs in Sarajevo, Bosnia, and I stepped out of that reception to take a cell phone call when I pick up my phone and it says, Steve Meyer. I know I'd better answer the call. He's a friend. He's a pheasant hunting buddy. I guess he's a neighbor in the neighborhood, not technically a constituent, but we are brothers by faith, by head, by heart, and I know the level of conviction that Steve Meyer has. And so I took his call, and when I stepped out of the reception, and he said, "You've already seen this on the news. I need your help. There are 3 students that will," he said, "one, probably 2 of them will not survive if we cannot get them out of Tanzania. The 3rd one likely will be handicapped for life, but is more likely to survive." And I know that he does orthopedic surgery in Tanzania, and I said, "Can't you help them there? Can't you fix them there?" And he said, "No, I can't. We don't have the equipment in Tanzania. We're not going to be able to save them unless we can get them out of Tanzania, get them back to Sioux City, where we can provide all the best medical care and surgery necessary to put their bodies back together." And that was his medical prognosis. Now, I know from previous times that I've been around Steve Meyer, the level of conviction that he has, and of course the depth of his heart. And so I said, "I think I know what you need from me." And he said, "Yes, their parents need to go along too, and we want to send along a doctor and a nurse." And he said, "I've only got just a little bit of time, and I'm going to have to leave Tanzania, but we need to get them out of here and while they are still alive." And so my job was to accelerate the visas, acquisition of visas for the 3 patients, kid patients, for each one of their mothers, and for the doctor and for the nurse that needed to accompany them back to the United States, and to promote and accelerate the issuance of passports, which nobody had that needed to travel here either. And that would be a function of the Tanzanian government, but a function of something that we might be able to encourage. And so that was the easy part. Doesn't sound easy, Mr. Speaker, but it was the easy part compared to the second part of the assignment Dr. Meyer gave me. And he said, "I need a medevac plane. And we're going to have to fly them out of Tanzania in a medevac plane." And he said, "I've got everything set up in Sioux City. It's at Mercy Hospital." He said, "All of us are going to donate our time, our medical care, the devices that will be used to do the reconstructive surgery. All of that is going to be provided. It's going to be at no cost, but we need to get them there and get them there fast." And so this is a high emergency. And I hung up the phone and I began to make phone calls. And the fortunate thing was I was leaving Bosnia shortly to go to Macedonia. Well, I employed the staff at the Bosnian embassy, the U.S. embassy in Bosnia, to pull some phone numbers together for me and start the outreach on this, and to accelerate the effort to get the visas, promote the passports, plane. And I want to thank the people there at the embassy, the U.S. embassy in Bosnia, for their work and their cooperation. And so I shortly arrived in Macedonia, where now I had a whole new embassy team to put to work, and they did. And they pulled together phone numbers and made connections for me, too. I spoke, I believe it was from Macedonia, to the Tanzanian embassy, U.S. embassy in Tanzania. And I want to thank Anthony Paglia. Anthony Paglia is the officer who issued the visas, and he was Johnny on the spot. He couldn't have moved any more quickly or with any more conviction once it happened, Mr. Speaker, that You know, when a congressman calls a staff person in an embassy in Tanzania, he doesn't have any way of knowing that it actually is a member of Congress, for one thing, and what is the level of urgency and credibility of that call. But I told him I can vouch for Dr. Steve Meyer, and I've known him for a long time. I know the level of his credibility and his conviction, his heart. I've spoken to that, Mr. Speaker. I relayed that to Anthony Paglia. And it seemed that the message wasn't clearly resonating because he didn't know of Dr. Steve Meyer. So I said to him that Steve Meyer is also working with working with Lazaro Nyalandu. Lazaro Nyalandu is an individual who ran for prime minister in Tanzania in the last election cycle, didn't win, but a fairly high name recognition within Tanzania. And when I gave Lazaro's name, you've heard me hesitate already, Mr. Speaker. I've always had trouble remembering his name, but it's Nyalandu. And I hesitated on his name, but I said, Lazaro, the prime minister candidate in Tanzania, is working with Dr. Meyer, and I can vouch for Dr. I know Lazaro, and I know if the two of those are working together, this is a credible endeavor, and you should help them in any way that you can. And he finished up and he gave me Lazaro's last name. He volunteered it, Nyalandu. He said, we know him. He was the only candidate for prime minister that actually answered our phone calls. And so I knew that he had a good relationship with the U.S. Embassy and that they had all of the incentive to move forward to expedite the visas. And I asked Anthony, find me also a medevac plane. Well, that was a very big ask for somebody that's in the business of issuing visas for travel. And he said he would go to work on that, but I knew it was very difficult. And so with the confidence that the visas would be moved expeditiously and that the encouragement to deliver the passports would be supported out of the U.S. Embassy, I moved on to begin looking for a medevac plane. And of course, there's life-saving techniques going on in the hospital in Tanzania trying to save the lives of these 3 badly broken bodies. And so, Mr. Speaker, as I moved then from Macedonia to Albania, I've been continually making phone calls trying to find a medevac plane. I talked to the White House. I talked to the West Wing of the White House, and in particular communicated with Steve Bannon and others, who then did the outreach to the Department of Defense and went so far as to check with Stuttgart, where they command AFRICOMs out of Stuttgart, Germany. The assets to do this didn't really exist in an available way. I reached even further into a security company that I have worked with who's had my security in the Middle East, in Iraq, and in Afghanistan, and they found a plane. This plane was sitting on the tarmac in the Middle East. It could have gone down. It was set up well enough to be a medevac plane, but the price, because it was a leased plane, and was $300,000. So I told them, I don't think I want to spend that amount of money out of my kids' inheritance. I'm not sure we could raise it to replace it, but put that plane on hold because I want to make some more phone calls and see if there's a better alternative. I kept making phone calls, and about 4 o'clock in that afternoon, in a little back street in Albania, I had a phone call connection with Reverend Franklin Graham. And I want to give credit in the congressional record to Elizabeth Soderholm, who was a staff person out of our U.S. Embassy in Albania, who made sure that that phone call made connection. As the cell signals were bad and the batteries were going down, nearly down on my phone, we made the connection with hers. And so I dialed, and I got an answer from Reverend Franklin Graham. And over the course of, it was less than a 5-minute conversation altogether. Over the course of about 3 minutes, I explained the situation to him, and he said, Reverend Franklin Graham of Samaritan's Purse said, I have a DC-8 that I can fly and move them out of Tanzania to Sioux City, Iowa. And he said, I'm willing to do that. I want to help. And I said, Reverend Graham, I don't know that I can raise the money for that. And he said, you don't have to. We'll take care of it. And at that moment, I knew that we had the problem solved, and we had a reasonable chance to save these 3 kids. And so, of course, I thanked him effusively, and I texted Dr. Meyer's number to Franklin Graham and Franklin Graham's number to Dr. Meyer, and said to each one of them, call each other right away. so that you can make this connection and get this plane set up and dispatched to evacuate these 3 patients out of Tanzania. And Dr. Meyer had no idea this was going on. He was 30 minutes from boarding his commercial flight out of Tanzania to come back to Iowa. Because of the obligations he had, he could not have stayed. And the phone rang, he answered it, and it was on the other end, "This is Franklin Graham, and I want to help." And that's when Steve Meyer knew that the problems, the difficulties were going to be resolved. And so in any case, at that point, they set up the logistics. The plane arrived in Tanzania, boarded these patients out of there, and flew them back to the United States, not without incident, but back to the United States. And again, I'm very, very grateful for all the people involved here. And I want to let this congressional record know, Mr. Speaker, that the driving force behind this was Dr. Steve Meyer. And it has been his heart to help the people of Tanzania for 2 decades. And anybody that's been around him like I have been, my pheasant hunting buddy, and the times that Marilyn and I have been involved in the fundraising efforts that go on with STEM in Sioux City, you just know you want to make sure that he's going to get it done, so why not make it as easy as possible on him? And that, and knowing that when that calling comes from above, you answer that call. So I wanted to point out some things here on the posters, and this is how this came together. These pictures were taken, I believe, 2.5 weeks ago, maybe 3.5 weeks ago, but the accident took place May 6th. And so within a couple of weeks of the accident, they had finished the surgery of our 3 victims here, and the orthopedic surgery that went in. And among them, Mr. Speaker, I will say among these 3, there were 5 broken arms. And it was I believe 3 broken legs. There were 2 fractured spines. There were 17 broken bones altogether. There was a broken jaw over here, and this was a fractured spine in her neck, and this is Sadia. And Wilson had a fractured femur. And when you add this all up, it would have been, I guess I'd better not necessarily point at which one, but both of these girls were at great risk of death in Tanzania and likely would not have made it. Wilson here in the middle likely would have survived, but he had a fractured femur, where in Tanzania it would have required that they amputate his leg at the hip. And now, as of a week ago Saturday, I went up to the Sioux City Bandits football game, indoor football, and they were co-captains for the team for the playoff game that took place that Saturday night. And they wheeled all 3 of them out to the middle of the field for the coin toss. And after that, then they came back and we had a little stage on the end where we watched the game from the stage. And they look a little fresher and more alert that night than they do in these pictures, Mr. Speaker. But they're now happy. Their parents are delighted and very, very grateful. This picture, this is Dr. Steve Meyer here in the picture, and I just can't say enough about a man who inspires everyone around him and makes things happen by force of will and faith that would not, and we would think could not happen otherwise. And then of the patients here, Wilson is the one that cracks me up the most. On that Saturday night, this young fellow that would have by now lost his leg up at the hip, I leaned down and I said to him, "Wilson, is what I heard about you yesterday, is that true?" And he looked at me and smiled a little bit. "Well, what?" And I said, "Did you really kick a ball yesterday? Did you stand up and kick a ball?" And he got this grin on his face and said, "Yes." And so that's how far this has come. This is a happy result, Mr. Speaker. And I wanted to also show the picture and his mother. To give you an example, he's got this ready smile. He's not the only one of the crew with a ready smile, but he's got a great ready smile. And part of he had a big wound in his head that you don't see in the picture too, but it doesn't suppress the grin on his face. And we did a little press conference there. It was the first time he'd been out of a hospital room. The only thing he had seen in America was the inside of a hospital room, and then wheeled down the hallway to the reception area of the hospital. And he's there with the 2 girls in their wheelchairs. That was also taken the same day. And the press asked him, "What is it you like best about America?" Well, the only thing he'd seen of America was the inside of the hospital. And he smiled and he said, everything. And they asked him, what is your favorite food here? And he said, everything. And they asked him only one more question. And is there anything else you'd like to say, Wilson? And he said, thank you. And that's something that the parents have been saying ever since. The three mothers that are here and the doctor and the nurse that are here are also to take care of them. And they're now out of the hospital. They're at Ronald McDonald's house there in Sioux City. They've been taking him out on occasion to get some fresh air and see what normal life is around our part of the country. And you can just see the heart in Steve Meyer here in this poster. And I would be remiss if I didn't have this poster up also tonight, Mr. Speaker. This is Samaritan's Purse. This is the DC-8 that Reverend Franklin Graham dispatched to fly our three patients out of Tanzania and into Sioux City, Iowa. This is the people that have gathered at the departure, wondering if they're ever going to see these three Tanzanian kids again. Many of these people will be people that were at the state funeral for the 36 who were killed in that bus accident. Tens of thousands came to the stadium as those 36 caskets were all lined up side by side, and the nation went into mourning in Tanzania because of that terrible loss that they had. And the tragedy that was there, that was commemorated by the attendance of tens of thousands, probably over 100,000 Tanzanians came to their soccer stadium for that huge funeral that they had. And now some of them come to the airstrip to see these three survivors, these miracle kids from Tanzania, be flown off to the United States. I can only imagine what it's like in their mind's eye, what they imagine is happening with their three children that have been flown over here to the United States. And the father of one of these patients said to Dr. Meyer, why? 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 And Dr. Meyer said, well, what do you mean, why? Why do you do this? Why are you willing to do this for our children? And his answer is, we're Christians and we're Americans, that's why. And so it is the head and the heart of our country, our people. It does come to us to reach out and lift others up and help them. And we can't help them all, we can't save them all. But every once in a while, there's a cry out and a need for a chain of individual miracles linked together without a connection, by the way, between Steve Meyer and Lazaro, who met years ago when Lazaro was going to college in Iowa. And then Lazaro Nyalandu, as he went to college in Iowa, he was put together by Steve Meyer's pastor and Steve Meyer. And they got to know each other and they became friends. And because of that relationship, Steve Meyer went to Tanzania and became one of the lead people on mission to Tanzania. If it hadn't been for that, he never would have formed STEM, the Siouxland Tanzania Educational Ministries. Would have never been formed had it not been for that connection more than 20 years ago. And if it had never been formed, the workers wouldn't have been behind the bus when it went off the road. And likely everybody would have perished in that bus rather than all but three. If they hadn't been behind the bus, we would have not heard about the injuries that they had, and we wouldn't have had the connection to fly them back to the United States. If I don't know Lazaro myself, I don't have that to use to convince convince Anthony Paglia that this is a credible ask. Now, he might have done it anyway. His head and his heart sounds good to me too, but it helped to have that series of networks already built. And I bring this up, Mr. Speaker, because I want people to know, the people that are listening in here, and especially young people as they form and shape their lives, that networking is worth a lot. And you can be the smartest person in the world with the best intentions in the world, but if you don't have relationships with people so that you can communicate, that you can share ideas, that you can connect and team up on projects, then you can't get a lot done. The smartest person in the world in a phone book hasn't had much effect on our society, but people with good convictions and good relationships and positive attitudes and a good heart can get a lot done that is good if they're connected with the right people. And so I just encourage, especially young people, go out there and build those networks. Build them while you're young. Build them while you're in school, when you're K through 12, when you're in college, when you're after college, when you're building those networks of young people that are going into the profession together, and understand that 40 years later, you're still going to have friends that you can call on to produce a good and positive result if you build those relationships and those networks. Not be reclusive. Push yourself out there and build friendships with people. And that multiplied itself over and over again. And I'm grateful that Franklin Graham took my call, and I carried enough credibility that actually worked that way too. That's another piece of networking. But I can't thank Reverend Franklin Graham enough. I remember sitting in my living room watching a black and white TV while Billy Graham was preaching and calling for an altar call. And that's a little bit of how we grew up in our family, clear back then when TVs were black and white. And now his son, Reverend Franklin Graham, took a phone call from me from Albania that resulted in a DC-8 being dispatched to fly the three patients out of Tanzania to Sioux City, Iowa, where they received surgery that repaired 17 broken bones, and by the way, with all of the medical devices donated by the company that produced them as well. And when I look at this, Doreen was paralyzed, particularly in her right leg, and there was no confidence as to whether she would ever be able to have any feeling in that leg or ever be able to walk again. Today, she has feeling in that leg. She has some movement in that leg. And my level of confidence that she'll walk again is pretty high right now. All the other prayers have been answered. Why not this one? I think the day comes when these three arrive back in Tanzania, and I'll predict the date. I think it'll be the 18th or 19th of August that they will be flown back to Tanzania. And I believe that these three patients, with their mothers with them, will walk down the steps off that plane onto the soil of Tanzania. And I believe that there will be tens of thousands of Tanzanians there to welcome them back home again, and the completion of this series of miracles that came about because Steve Meyer had the right head and heart at all times, and he had the right networks with people like Lazaro Nyalandu and people working in our U.S. embassies like Anthony Piglia and Elizabeth Soderholm, who set up that call, and our ambassadors within each of those places that promoted and allowed this to happen, and including Ambassador Liu and also Ambassador Bailey, whom I worked with. I got the good news when I was in Kosovo that it was likely to be completed then, that they had reached that transaction, and I called it a transaction. They had put together the logistics so that the plane was going to go and pick them up. I found myself then at the Vatican shortly after that, and kind of as maybe a little extra frosting on the cake, I was offered the opportunity to do the Bible reading at St. Peter's Basilica at the Vatican that Sunday. And I don't know how that came to me, unless it was just a little reward from God that said, well done. Well done by a lot of people. And these young people are now reconstructed. Their reconstructive surgery is completed, and they're on the mend. Two of the three are standing and walking and getting stronger, and each of them are taking physical therapy, and their attitudes are good, their pain levels are down, and the projection is that by mid to late August they'll be ready to go back to Tanzania. That's an American success story, Mr. Speaker, and it's one that I'm happy to relay here on the floor of the House of Representatives and deliver the credit to so many people who did so much to make this work, particularly Dr. Steve Meyer, but all of that for three kids in Tanzania who, it's a miracle that they survived the bus accident, and now for their futures, the three Miracle Kids of Tanzania have a legacy to. And I expect that in years going forward, in 10 and 20 and 30 and 40 years from now, wherever they go in the world, wherever they go, especially in Tanzania, they will be known as the Tanzanian Miracle Kids, the ones who survived against such improbable, of them should come the kind of ambassadorship that links together Tanzania and the United States. And who knows what gets built that helps them help themselves. Who knows how much of their own agriculture will be expanded so they can raise their own food. Who knows how much of their educational system will be built out because of the inspiration that can come from young people whose lives have been saved by the technology and education that we have here. Who knows how much of their spirit of faith is going to be bolstered by the good hearts of people that only wanted to do something good, only wanted to reach out their hand and help. And so, Mr. Speaker, I'm very happy and grateful that this story is on its way to a very happy conclusion. And I can't say enough about the children, about the mothers who expressed their gratitude at the game. One of the mothers continued to always offer some little chicken strips for my granddaughter, my 10-year-old granddaughter Rachel, to eat. And Rachel couldn't quite understand why she was supposed to be eating all the time. And whenever Rachel would take a bite of it, then she would hear, "You like." And I said, "Well, Rachel, it's because there are only a few words in English that this girl's mother knows, and she wants to open up a conversation with you. And so she's offering you food. That's a way of her expressing a gratitude, not only to us, but to our country, and a way of having a conversation and communicating." And so it's a good experience for Rachel, too. But I can't say enough about Reverend Franklin Graham, a Samaritan's Purse, this effort that is global. Hesitate, and again, it was not a 5-minute conversation between me and Reverend Franklin Graham that was able to set up this transportation. And the conversation with Franklin Graham and Dr. Steve Meyer, not very technical. It's where are they, what do we need to do, how are we going to figure out how to get there, can we set the plane up to be a medevac plane. He did express that to me also in the phone call with me. And so, Mr. Speaker, this is a story that has it's on the way to a very, very happy conclusion. And I hope sometime, maybe in September, I can come back to the floor and report on the return of the Tanzania Miracle Kids to Tanzania. And hopefully I'll have some pictures then of the crowd that's bound to be gathered together, and a great celebratory event to counteract or be juxtaposed against the terrible, terrible tragedy of that bus accident that killed 36. And it was 33 students and 2 of the teachers and the bus driver. Only these 3 children survived, and they survived because they were at the back of the bus when the bus landed on its nose. So 17 broken bones, 2 broken spines, 5 of 6 fractured arms, and 3 or 4 of the legs were fractured in one bone or another. But also, I should say that Dr. Quentin Durward was the neurosurgeon who did a lot of that technical work on the spines, along with Dr. Steve Meyer. And he's one also who I know that his head and heart's in the right place. And I know that I've left off many, many of the medical providers at Mercy Hospital in Sioux City who donated their time and are so dedicated to this. And I regret that I didn't have a list to read into the record, Mr. Speaker, but I also want to express my gratitude to those who I left off the list. So with that, I believe that I should conclude my presentation here on the Tanzania Miracle Kids, and again, thank all of those that are involved, and transition my discussion over to a few other things that are part of the current concerns here in America.